Hi, I'm Greg Uland with Reynolds & Reynolds, and this is Connected. As we wrap up 2024, let's take a look back at some of the top listened to episodes of the year. First one up that we're going to take a look at is with Jake Trott and Jason Tuck from Automotive Warranty Network. I really enjoyed this conversation because it's a topic that's not always front and center, but Jason and Jake really dive into issues to look for, submitting warranty claims, and how much money is often left on the table. So let's give it a listen. Yeah. So based on all that experience, and all those reps over and over every single month, what are some of the things that stick out to you? Common issues that result in delays or things that can be missed? Any highlights? Maybe if you had like a top 3 list or something like that. Are there any things that stand out that a dealer who's gonna listen to this and they're gonna then go back and say, all right, let's actually review this. There's some real money on the table. Let's review it and see what our process looks like. Are there any kind of like top 3, top 5 things to look for?
I think a big one is going to be a relationship between the warranty admin and the technician and the advisor, right? They have to be on the same page. They have to have an open communication line to discuss some of the issues that the warranty admin is seeing on the RO. And one of the things that we really preach is not all these warranty admins have a technical skill set or background like a technician does. So the way I always explain it to our clients and dealers is write the RO like you're explaining it to your grandma. If your grandma can understand this, anybody really should. And at the end of the day, that is what these manufacturers are looking for, because the people in the warranty departments for each manufacturer probably don't have the technical background and skill set either. So, if we do that front loaded, it just makes for a more streamlined and efficient process with inside of your store. I would say communication between the advisor and technician as well. The advisor has to, on that initial write-up, has to get pertinent information from the customer. We have to have a good write-up so our technicians can properly test these cars to make sure that they're getting the same errors that the customer is. That's the big customer satisfaction piece there. I would say those are my top 2.
Yeah, there's a lot that play into the warranty side of our business, right? Having accurate concerns, causes, corrections, what actually is wrong with the vehicle that the manufacturer should pay for that repair. So the better the product on the front end makes the warranty administrator's job much, much easier for looking up those labor operations, closing that RO in a timely manner, and submitting it to the manufacturer. Every manufacturer grades the dealership on how fast are you going to get that claim submitted to me. And if you're not meeting that number, that could potentially create a problem or an audit with the store.
Next up is Glenn Mercer, a longtime automotive researcher and author of the blog Car Charts. If you don't subscribe to his newsletter, you definitely should. Glenn is a gem in our industry, always coming out with great insights. But the part of our conversation that really stood out to me was how youth sports can impact buying behaviors. So check this one out. One post that you had just a couple weeks ago that I found, I don't know, it made me go, which is probably what you're going for every time you write one of these, I assume. But it was, you talked a lot about youth sports and the impact that youth sports have on vehicle ownership. It was an interesting take. If you don't mind, maybe share a little bit about your perspective there, because it was, I don't know, I found it very interesting.
I noticed in the Wall Street Journal, actually, a parent in some column somewhere just writing, saying, my entire life is now consumed with driving my kids around to sports, lessons and games. And that I connected it all into my brain at that point in time and said, that might be a good illustration for my European mobility obsessed friends as to why the Swiss Army knife of cars we're so dependent on the United States. And that is, among other things, sports. And so I wrote a post about it. There's almost no research on this. We don't really know how many miles mom and dad are hauling around the kids to soccer camp and things like that. But there was one paper I tracked down, which tracked a competitive swim team, swim team league in, I think it was South Carolina. and going to meets, going to the pool, going back from the pool, picking up the other kids on the way to the pool, et cetera. And depending on how you looked at it, it was 10 to 25% of their annual car mileage hauling the kids around on this. And again, we can't extrapolate it. We can't say, well, we'll take South Carolina and multiply it up to the rest of the country. But it's a huge consumer of car miles. And this is, again, where the car's flexibility really comes into play. I got one kid, fine, I can take him or her. The other kids in the team are all going to Mickey D's after the meet, whatever, et cetera. This week, that pool's closed. We got to go to the other one. I can get there. I don't have to look up bus schedules. I don't have to do anything. I can just go. And
Sure.
Those, especially if we have any hockey parents listening, my heart goes out to you, especially in that, getting ice time at 4 a.m. in some rink 30 miles away is, Valhalla. And I would have used the hockey example, because then you got to throw all the skates and the sticks and everything else in, and the helmets, and you're not going anywhere without, a Volkswagen Atlas at a minimum. So that was the whole. It wasn't much of a huge point of that, but to point out that kind of usage is very, very important to a lot of Americans, but it doesn't really show up in our usual discussion about how many hours we're wasting in commuting or things like that.
In-studio guests are always some of my favorite on Connected, and this year we had a first. We had 2 people in studio for one conversation. It was great to have the legendary folks from Asodu, Kyle Mountseer and Paul J. Daly on the episode. Give this one a listen as they talk about automotive storytelling at its finest. So how do you tie all this? So I'm trying to think of this, and you gave some examples earlier, Apple, and there's plenty of brands out there that do a great job with marketing, right? But how do you elevate your marketing to this macro level, this categorical level, right? You mentioned Got Milk, right? A bunch of dairy farmers get together and say, we got to sell more dairy. Or you mentioned F1 and how it was targeted to increase awareness of F1, but ultimately it increased awareness of all racing, right? All professional racing. So as a marketer, right? So if I'm fill in the blank dealership group, right? And I'm interested obviously in promoting me, right? How do I go above that, right? Because ultimately, what I think I'm hearing you say, and if I'm off, then tell me. But what I think I'm hearing you say is better awareness is good for everybody, right? Awareness of the industry is good for everybody. It could be automotive, it could be any industry, but just awareness of the industry is good. Rising tide it brings all the ships up, right? So how do you almost get out of your own way, right? And focus less on the 30 days that are in front of me and more on, okay, how do we lift our industry up so that people see us collectively in a different light?
I think the very first step, non-negotiable, is that you have to be willing, and I know this may sound like maybe overly practical or like an obvious one, you have to have patience. You have to know that, because when we think marketing in automotive, oftentimes we think of a 30-day cycle. We think of specials and offers and especially the larger your group gets, and especially once you take a step into the publics, there's very little patience. And if you're a public, you're not afforded patience because the market isn't patient.
Right.
So if you're going to implement something, it better show an uptick or a J curve within one earnings report.
Yeah.
Or you're going to get shut down. Private groups have more flexibility here. Smaller groups and smaller stores, I think, even have more flexibility. But patience, because how do you do it? The first thing is that you understand you're planting and cultivating a garden, right? You're not buying a head of lettuce, right? So you're going to have to till the ground. You're going to have to plant the seed. You're going to have to water it. You're going to have to care for it. When it grows a little bit, you can't just leave it alone. You're going to have to wait till it gets strong enough. And then eventually it gets big enough that you can swing on it, right?
Sure.
And it grows fruit, and you can put all the things, sit under the shade. So patience is the first practical thing. And I think a lot of people can get caught up in the allure of I want a great brand. I want people to think of me this way. I want people, and it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Life doesn't work that way, because building a brand with your community is literally like cultivating a relationship, and that will never happen fast. You can tell first interviews, first dates, right? You can look like a hero to anybody, right? And most people are like, we'll see. Especially if you're a business, especially if you're a car dealership.
Yeah.
And so patience, and then you have to think a level above the product you sell. You literally have to start thinking outside the product you sell.
The average car deal requires 39 feet of forms, and exactly 0 of those feet were requested by car dealers. On this next episode, I was joined by another Greg Schaefer, who's Vice President of Compliance at Reynolds, and he talked about areas to look for when reviewing your forms, frequency to review them, and a lot of other great tips. So give this one a listen. You know, I talk at least a lot about, the amount of forms that need signed to get a deal done. Right. And when you print them out and you run them end to end, on average across the country, it's about 39 feet of paper. Right. So if you do a deal, 39 feet of paper. But it hasn't always been that way. So thinking about over time and maybe the trajectory, how that has changed. If you think back 10, 20, 30 years, how does today's world differ from what it was, back whatever segment of time you want to look at?
I mean, a couple of key things. One is certainly technology. So
Yep.
Now you have this stuff coming out of a computer, or you have electronic, documents going straight like they do to Route 1 using the contracts. So that's been a big change. I do think certainly it didn't used to be 39 feet. I think it's probably 2 or 3 documents. I might have to ask Terry. He's actually my senior by a little bit. The other thing, though, that I think has changed is the proactive nature, new laws, UDAP, unfair and deceptive trade practices, those kind of things. And I've lost my train of thought when I tried to tell you what the acronym was. The Attorney General's offices, the CFPB, the FTC, there have been so many, particularly in the last several years. There's a real, I want to be careful how I say it. There's a lot more focus, a lot more laws, a lot more opinion at government circles that dealers are doing the wrong thing. And there's always going to be, in any industry, bad players. And
Sure.
When they get exposed and something's on TV, suddenly all car dealers are doing bad things. And we know there's a tremendous number of car dealers doing the right thing or trying to. And the laws have become much more onerous. It's so complicated now. To do a buyer's order 20 years ago, really, there wasn't that much you had to have in there. And now there's a tremendous number of things. And there's so many more things coming out. The CARS rule, which has been, front and center for quite a while. And I know that's not the favorite term, but that program, fortunately, obviously we had to stay, Texas and the NADA filed the suit. But Reynolds and Reynolds is still working on that. We haven't stopped because obviously some version of that is going to come through. We're very fortunate that in our company, working with Hudson Cook, the idea has always been make the documents easy to read, make sure they all work together. All those philosophies from the early days of putting a document program together, we still do those. So a number of the things that new law is going to require, our forms already represent a great deal of that. So will there need to be new forms? More than likely. Will there be adjustments to the existing ones? I'm sure. But I would imagine ours will have less alteration to be done due to the fact that they already follow a lot of those concerns that the CARS rule brings out.
During the summer, I got to sit down and talk with Mike Martinez, who's the COO at Dealer On. We talked a lot about digital retail strategy and online strategy. Mike's been in auto retail for a quarter of a century, going back to his days with Cobalt. Really enjoyed this conversation. Give it a listen. Talk a little bit, Mike, about, all right, so just kind of being blunt, websites can be viewed pretty easily as a commodity. Right. I mean, if you can get inventory, you can put it out there. You can have, pages across the dealership. You have service. You have, your used inventory. You have your new inventory. There's only so much you can do with a website. Right. So, and then you get an OEM program involved, and there's certain requirements. So, give me from your perspective, because I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming it's a little more elaborate than what I just described, which is why I'm asking the question. How do you stay out of that commodity world when it comes to a website? If I'm a dealer and it's like a website's a website, how do you stay out of that?
Well, so first of all, I mean, a commodity means that everybody needs to have one. I don't necessarily take umbrage at that. There's the word might implicate, low price, but that's not the case. Gasoline's a commodity too, and that's pretty expensive these days. I think the limitation to the website, if you just go back to the things I was saying with regard to signals, is only as limited as our imagination. It is, I would make the case right now that the website is the most valuable real estate that a dealership owns. In the past, you could not have a website and you could still sell cars. Today, I bet you that if you turned off your website, you would see a really substantial drop in your sales, and you would probably be out of business fairly quick. So that digital website or that digital real estate has become, incredibly valuable, and to the dealerships, it's become mission critical. And because it's software and it's only limited in its growth and impact to a dealer's business as our imaginations are limited. You think about the incredibly cool stuff we're doing now with data and personalization. You think about the incredibly cool stuff that's down the road as new technologies like artificial intelligence start to gain practical application in retail. You look at just the innovations we introduce on a daily basis to our customers. While it's commodity in that everyone has to have one, it's definitely not commodity in being any kind of not moving target. It's a fast moving, dynamic segment of our business, and I think we've just really it's really just scratching the surface of how we interact with our customers.
I think the conversation I learned the most from this year was with the fleet queen, Sandra Gonzalez. Sandra's an absolute expert in the fleet space. Wherever she goes, she grows business extremely rapidly. We talked about a lot in this conversation, but two things that really stood out to me were finding your niche in a bigger metro market, and then also the importance of establishing a broad network for the fleet business. Give this one a listen. Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right, I do want to shift again real quick because I love what you've done from a marketing perspective. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, right? We talked about the Fleet Queen and that branding. But to go even a step further, one of the things that I've noticed you do, I've seen it on LinkedIn. I'm sure you do it in other places, probably in your newsletter as well. But you're really good at finding a problem, right? And articulating that problem and then offering a solution to it in a way that maybe nobody else has. So one example I saw, and you probably have a million of these, maybe you could share, but one that I saw that I was like, oh, that's a great idea, is you realize that there were a bunch of schools essentially that had funds available for transportation of a 7 to 8 passenger vehicle. Well, the Ford Transit, they stopped making the 7 to 8 passenger version of. So you said, what's a great solution to this problem is the Expedition. It's a comfortable vehicle. It's got 3 rows. It seats 8 or 7, depending on the configuration. If you're interested, let me know. So I thought that was a great way to spin things. And again, you probably have other examples, but I'm curious to hear your thought process on that. How you find those things. I assume it's intentional, but how you find those things and how you decide to frame them up.
I think it's in that particular scenario, I was getting so many phone calls from school districts and I didn't have a solution for them. And I was sort of in a panic. What are we going to do? And I spend a lot of time meditating. And meditation just sort of allows me to get clear answers on things, because when I'm a hustle mode all the time, you definitely don't have a clear mind to find solutions about things. So one day I was doing my workout in the morning and I was thinking to myself, well, how the heck do we move 8 to 10 people? What vehicles do we have that might offer that solution? What am I going to do for these schools? Because there's they have to spend this money before the end of the fiscal year. What are we going to do? And I realized the Expedition holds 8 people. Why would I not think of that? So I actually made that post. And it was very, very interesting because sometimes the response you think you're going to get is not what you end up getting. And coincidentally enough, I had an upfitter reach out, and he informed me that there are aftermarket upfitters that recertify transits now. And they will take a 12-passenger van and they will make it into a 8 or 10-passenger van and recertify it so that it can be insured. And I was literally just mind just blown. I was like, why did I know about this?
Right.
And that's sort of how it goes when things transition and there's 20 things transitioning at the same time, and you've got all new models. You're trying to learn the new models, and it's like, oh well, they got rid of the 8 and 10 passenger vans. And at the time, I really wasn't super focused on schools. I was more focused on the law enforcement and fire market. And so I really didn't think about it. But then when this came up, I was like, oh boy, we need a solution. So I try to find those problems and put them out there because either you're going to get a huge response from customers or you're going to learn something. And when you say something that no one else is saying, or ask a question that no one else is asking, typically somebody can offer you insight into how to solve that problem if you haven't found a solution on your own. So that's sort of why I put it out there.
Earlier this year, GoMoto released a report on the service check-in process and where dealers are succeeding and where maybe some expectations from consumers aren't quite being met. I got to sit down with Corey Kohler to go through the results of the report and talk in detail about opportunities that we have in the service drive. Corey is a good friend of mine, and I really enjoyed the conversation, so give this one a listen. So I want to talk to you a little bit too, and we'll ease into it. But we did a study recently, and I wanted to get your read on it, mostly because of your background, and not because you were out necessarily doing the survey, but the information presented in the survey that we did for GoMoto was interesting, and some of it's validating, right, which is obvious. But also there's some pieces to it that's like, okay, well that aligns or that surprises. So. Really it looked at dealers and then also consumers and, kiosk usage and expectations in the service drive. So I don't know, maybe any highlights on that you want to call out first, and then maybe we can dig into a couple of pieces too.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting look at some of the challenges that the dealers face and that the consumers have kind of insight and opinion for. As an example, one of the things that really stood out for me was kind of that time it takes to be able to get checked in. And I think a lot of times we think we're doing great with it, right? And perception sometimes plays with your recollection of what that experience feels like.
Well, depending on which side of the interaction you're on.
Depending
right?
on which side of the interaction you're on, right? So, from a dealer's perspective, they're like, we're great. We're getting people in and out, and it's quick, and we're working as fast as we can. But a lot of times, to the consumer on the other side of it, you get a minute and a half, 2 minutes in, and now it feels like it's longer than that, right? Like if you've ever had to call someplace and be on hold for service, or, you've been waiting, we're down in Florida, so we go to Disney all the time, right? When you're standing in that line, it feels a lot longer than, what you thought it was going to be standing in that line. And I think a lot of times we fall into that trap a little bit, even in stores where, we have really good processes, that the expectation from consumers has changed tremendously over the last, 3 to 5 years, and the experiences that we have in other retail environments and in other service environments, right? We would go and stand 10 deep in line to be able to check our bags into the airline counter. And now I can walk up to any one of the kiosks that's there and literally, 30, 45 seconds, have my bag dropped and on my way to the gate. So, I think the expectation of consumers has changed considerably, but it also allows us to kind of temper some of those things where it feels like we're doing great, but we might be able to be benefiting from having some additional options.
Topics like fraud and protecting your dealership remain top of mind throughout 2024. I got to sit down with Frank Toms from Auto Data Direct, and we talked about synthetic identity fraud, what it is, how it happens, and how you can protect against it. So give this one a listen. Yeah. So as this grows, as synthetic fraud kind of grows as a trend, for anybody who hasn't, been hopefully impacted by it, but paid attention to it too much yet, can you put a definition on synthetic fraud, specifically synthetic identity theft, and what that means, what it entails? How do you define it?
Sure. It seems like recently the definition is actually broadening. Like I said, I don't claim to be the expert in this field, but what I can tell you is synthetic fraud means that they're taking some pieces of real information, verifiable information, and then they're combining that with synthetically generated information, like completely fictitious information. Some will go as far to actually build up a credit profile by paying bills under this false synthetic identity, build up that credit rating in order to then commit a larger financial crime later down the road. But other definitions are now starting to include just the fraudulent components of the transaction. So if they generate a fake MSO, for example, is one component of the case study that I'd like to share with you here today. That could be considered a component of synthetic fraud as well. And then identity theft is kind of bulked in there, but that's when you're actually stealing someone's real identity and performing the fraud in that way. So that's kind of the distinction.
Got it. Okay, so go ahead and dig in. You mentioned a case study or dealer that you've kind of had the opportunity to talk with about this. What do you? I'm not familiar, so go ahead and dig in. What are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, synthetic fraud is certainly a growing problem that we're facing in the industry. Just for some quick stats, 3/4 of dealers have experienced fraud in the past few years, with a staggering 60% of franchise dealers reporting a loss of 3 or more vehicles a year. So those numbers took me back a little bit, but experts are estimating that this type of fraud will amount to a $10 billion loss to the industry by 2025.
This one is a familiar name and face from countless conferences and events. If you've been to any event in 2024, you probably saw Steve Greenfield there. I really enjoyed our conversation. He shed some light on what he's doing in the venture capital space and the problems that he's really drawn to and investing in to help solve for dealers. So give this conversation a listen. I want to go there in just a second. It's interesting hearing you talk, and I'm thinking about, how all this comes together, right? And you hear that story, and it's like, man, that makes sense. And then we look back on it now, right? And we see where dealers are today and their ecosystem that they have. And it's like, man, I wish all this stuff actually talked to each other.
Right.
It's like there's still all these silos and trying to get data from one place to the next. And it's duplicated and it's inaccurate and it's spelled wrong over here, but it's right over here. So it's two different records. And, it's I think everybody's dream to be able to just have that single, really record that's consolidated, that has all that information. Because you think about the power that it can have to have that single record. So I know it's still a struggle for a lot of dealers out there. It's like, man, I wish we didn't have 17 different places that we're tracking vehicles in and
Right.
customers in.
Yeah.
So it's such a great mindset, and it's just the ability to execute can be difficult, right? And
Yeah, and at that point, the concept of an API was a new concept.
Sure.
Right? I mean, typically what was talked about is that you would buy a company and then you would effectively re-architect the software to be on a common code base. And this concept of an API would mean that you could run two different code bases and just have them intercommunicate the touch points that made sense. But that was a relatively new concept 15 years ago, and you see how that has evolved now. But it's amazing. To your point, it's awfully frustrating, I think, for dealers in general to say, I can go source what I perceive to be the best point solutions out there,
Sure.
best of breed. But then, the actual, where we fall down as an industry is those integrations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I have duplication of I go to a new car manager's, desktop and I see them have like 7 tabs open.
Oh, yeah.
And they're cutting and pasting VIN numbers back and forth between applications.
Well, and sometimes you'll even see sticky notes on the monitor for logins to each one of those.
Yes,
things.
that's right, exactly. So it's like, as much as there was this vision for what could be, an easier, better path. And by the way, all of that means we can't deliver yet on the utopian consumer experience, because if dealers are navigating from one tool to another, you can imagine what the consumer's experience is like, right? You hear stories all the time like, well, I already did a credit app online.
Right.
Why do I have to go into the store and do another repetitive credit app? Can't you use my information? And the salesperson is either unknowing,
Right.
give them the benefit of the doubt. I won't call them lazy, but unknowing,
Sure.
because they're like, I don't even know how to retrieve that information to populate this other system where I need to actually submit your credit,
Right.
because that was a lead form online. So we're still creating unnecessary friction to the consumers in that transition from going online to in-store. 15 years later, where we could all go to a whiteboard and map out what would be the ideal utopian experience, but in some ways we haven't made much progress, if any, during the last 15 years.
I know. All right, rounding out our top 10 is a topic that was very front of mind in 2024, cybersecurity and dealership protection. I had the opportunity to sit down with my friend Chris Gologanoff. He's got a strong background in cybersecurity, so he shared some best practices and tips on what you can do to make sure that you're in a good position to be protected. Chris, one of the other things I wanted to pick your brain on, cybersecurity is something that you have a background in. And, cybersecurity is an extremely front of mind topic right now. And we've seen it kind of ebb and flow as far as where it fits in our mind share, right? Because it's one of those things that always has been and always will be extremely important. I mean, you can't understate how important it is. But when something like what's happening in our industry right now is happening, it's front of mind for everybody, right? So when you think about dealers, what are, again, in your experience with the IT background and the cybersecurity background, what are some of the steps that dealers can take today, if they haven't already, just to make sure that, they're as prepared as possible for if anything like this were to happen to them?
Well, I think the word prepared is the best way to describe it, because I don't know if you can ever prevent it, but you can definitely prepare. And I think the most important piece of that preparation is if you make it hard enough, really for any criminal activity, but specifically with cyber criminals, I think what they're looking for is a low-hanging fruit. I heard somebody the other day that they used to send out 10,000 letters and were hoping to get a 0.5% response rate with actual letters in the mail, right? So now they're sending 100,000 emails, but still expecting that same 0.5, but it's so much easier to do it over email. And I think just some smaller things to make it more difficult, like don't make it easy for them being the cyber criminals, don't make it easy for them to focus or pinpoint their activity on you because you're making mistakes internally. So I always go back to, easy things like multi-factor authentication, a good password management policy where you're changing passwords on a regular basis. They have to have, multiple keys. Mm-hmm. I think the most important is probably the employee training though. So there's a lot in there right now where employees, what do I say? I've heard people say like hackers aren't the reason for a cyber breach. It's employees that are the reason for a cyber breach. And what I mean by that is somebody internally made a mistake, clicked on something they shouldn't have, did something on a website or gave information to somebody they shouldn't have. And now that hacker or cyber criminal has that information and is going to try to use that to get into your system. And then once they're in the system, being able to monitor that. So I think the other piece is having the software tools to protect your environment, your network, to make sure that if something did happen, somebody sees it, they get an alert on it. And the most important piece to that is actually taking action on that alert. So a ton of tools out there right now. Okay, this happened on this PC at this date. I send a text message alert to, this IT person, and then they looked at the alert, or maybe they didn't even notice the alert because they get so many of them and did nothing. The most important piece is you get those alerts, you have a team of people that are there to monitor that and then take action, whether it be quarantine that off the network or, figure out if there's anything internally that they need to shut down or do, maybe a good backup policy or backups for some of those things in case something were to happen. But there's two parts to an alert, just like there's two parts to an alarm system or two parts to, there's the actual alert and the alarm, and then there's the what are we going to do about it. And if you don't have both of those, then you really just don't have anything.
Thank you very much for an amazing 2024. I wish you a successful finish to the year, a strong finish to it, and an amazing 2025. Looking forward to seeing everybody hopefully at NADA. We'll be live on the floor in the Reynolds booth, so come find us and say hi. Before we hop off, don't forget you can watch or listen to all episodes of Connected on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify podcasts. And make sure to hit subscribe so you're notified every other week when new episodes are released. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.